Hello everybody, and welcome to Bread Market's Wine Cache number 4. This is a smattering of Spain. So for our 4th YouTube video here, we are going to be diving into Spain just a little bit. We are literally going to just be doing a smattering. So I did something a little different here than what we usually do. For the Wine Cache Club, we usually look for kind of small regions, lesser known grapes, things a little bit off the beaten path, things that people maybe have never heard before or tasted before. And for Spain, there's a lot of options certainly in terms of going that way. But about 2 weeks into thinking about what I wanted to do for this, I kind of did a 180. So we're still kind of adhering to the Wine Cache philosophy of small production and small producers, stuff that you may not find in a lot of other places. But we kind of flip the script when it comes to lesser known regions and lesser known grapes. So we're going to actually focus kind of what we did for the Vinophile, the other wine club, and we're going to kind of focus on 2 regions in particular, and 2 very popular regions in Rioja and Ribera del Duero. So kind of why the change, why are we doing it this way? For a number of reasons. I think for me personally, I love Spain. You know, people who love everything French are called Francophiles, or the term to use to express how they feel about French is called Francophile. Whatever the equivalent is for Spain is that for me. Whether it's Spainophile, Hispanophile, I'm sure there's a word for it. And whatever it is, I am one of them. I love Spain so much. It's probably my favorite place on earth. And I love everything about it. The food, the cheese, the wine certainly, the people, the art, the architecture. There's an energy to Spain. There's something about their culture that is just so fantastic and wonderful. And that being said, I wanted to make this a very special, not only wine class, but a special month of the wine club. So the reason I focused on just the 2 regions is because we were able to find 2 really small producers who are fairly well known and who make incredible wines at a pretty good price. And I just thought, you know what, I'm never going to be able to do 2 wines like of this high of quality this year again, probably. So I was like, well, we just got to do it because these 2 wines are phenomenal, and we'll get into them a little later in the video. But it's kind of why I switched my view. It was just a great opportunity to try 2 of the best producers in all of Spain, not only in their respective regions of Rioja and Ribera del Duero. So before we get into the wines themselves and the 2 regions we're going to be focusing on, let's talk a little bit about Spain in general as a country that makes wine, as a major wine producing country in Europe. Spain has more acres planted under vine than any other country in the world. France is second, Italy third, and Italy and France will every once in a while swap. Turkey, believe it or not, is 4th, or it shouldn't be that surprising. People have been making wine in Turkey or in the region we now call Turkey almost as long as human beings have kind of made settlements and started making wine and fermenting stuff. And then the US usually is in the 5th spot for acres of land under vine. So Spain, most grapes under, or most acres of grapes under vine. There's a huge number of indigenous grapes in Spain, obviously, with kind of what I just said. With all those acres of vines, they have hundreds and hundreds of grape varietals. And also, confusingly, a lot of the same grapes have different names. So Tempranillo, for example, which we're going to be focusing on in this class, has 60 different names in Spain alone. It is the primary red grape throughout Spain for red wine. It's certainly not exclusive. There are a lot of other red wine grapes in Spain, but Tempranillo is king. But in every region of Spain has a different name for Tempranillo. So in Rioja, while it's called Tempranillo, the grape is Tinto de Pais and Tinto Fino in Ribera del Duero. So Ribera del Duero has two different names for Tempranillo that are not Tempranillo. And we'll get more into that a little later. Wine production has been going on in Spain for a very long time, at least since the Roman times, possibly before that. It is, or has, pretty ideal climate and topography for winemaking. It's actually a much safer area or country to make wine as opposed to like France, for example. Spain has a lot more consistent climate in terms of warmth and consistency. So, in a bad vintage in Spain, it's not usually because of frost or cold weather, which can happen in France quite a bit, especially in places like Alsace and Champagne and even Bordeaux. If it's a wet year in Spain, if there's a lot of rain at the wrong time, that can cause a off vintage. But even that, Spain tends to get a lot less rainfall than France and even Italy. So Spain is kind of an ideal climate, has an ideal climate and topography for winemaking. And as a result, they produce amazing wines. Their wines are not probably as well known or even as well lauded in some circles as French wines and even Italian. Some of that has to do with the history of the history of Spanish winemaking in general, and we'll talk about that kind of in a little bit here too. Spain kind of got a late start on producing fantastic wines. They went through a period in the Middle Ages to the early to mid-19th century, actually through the end of the 19th century, of producing great wines, and then in the 20th century was essentially a disaster for Spain, and I'll get a little more into that when I talk about Rioja. So there's a quick overview of Spain, and we'll talk a little bit now about Rioja and Ribera del Duero specifically. And specifically, why did I choose? You guys had nothing to do with it. Why did I choose these two regions when Spain is so diverse and has so many different wine regions that offer a number of different styles of wine? Well, Rioja and Ribera del Duero are the two premier winemaking regions in all of Spain. And if winemakers and fans of Spanish wines, specifically from Priorat, might throw Priorat in there as well. And they certainly have an argument. Priorat has some incredible red wines that range in price from $14, $15 to $200, $300. And there are a number of different varietals, Garnacha and Caranilla, probably prime among them, with some Cab and Merlot. But in terms of tradition, in terms of what's known, in terms of consistency, it's Rioja and Ribera del Duero that kind of still, to me, are the king of red wines in Spain, and are the two stylistically fulcrums of Spanish. When you think Spanish red wine, those are the two regions you primarily think of. And some of the best wineries in all of Spain, Muga, Ramirez de Ganuza, Lopez de Heredia, Cune, and then Ribera del Duero, Vega Sicilia, Alion, Emilio Maro, Tinto Pescara, Abadia Retuerta. These are the heavyweights. These are the best of the best. And they've both been doing it a little longer than Priorat. Although Ribera has a little bit more of a checkered history in terms of quality. The other reason why I picked these two regions, besides what I just mentioned, is the fact that they both use Tempranillo. So, as I said, in Ribera del Duero, it's often referred to as Tinto de Pais or Pais and Tinto Fino, but we're talking about the same grape. And what's cool is doing these two regions side by side is that even though they're made from the same grape, they're vastly different stylistically. And so I'm going to be talking in very broad strokes here in this particular moment. But Tempranillo from Rioja, the wines, and they could range from simple table wines to super complex, age-worthy phenomenon. But in general, Riojas tend to be a little more elegant, a little more subtle. They can be more nuanced, although that's not always the case. They tend to have a lot of secondary characteristics in terms of you have the fruit and the oak, but there's also tends to be like a lot of cedar, herbaceousness, a lot of floral qualities, you know, and just kind of all these different beautiful subtle layers to them. And Ribera del Duero is almost the exact opposite in a lot of ways. The wines are big and bold and brooding and super tannic sometimes, and you know, more akin to big oaky structured cabs that a lot of American palates like so much. And one isn't necessarily better than the other, but they're just very different. And being made from the same varietal, I find that very interesting. And they're not that far apart. I mean, regionally, they're only maybe 2 hours apart from each other. But the topography and climate of each one is very, very different. So the heavyweights are reds, best wines in Spain. You have the varietals being the same in terms of the red wines, but vastly, vastly, vastly different. So just very cool to compare them, especially with the two producers that we have. And we'll start getting into some of the regions and start having some of this delicious wine. So Rioja, considered the epicenter of wine for Spain, has been for a couple centuries at least, still is today. Rioja is much more diverse in terms of the number of different grape varietals that they grow and the types of wine that they make. Rioja is certainly known for their red wines and their Tempranillo-based red wines. They also make some of the best white wines, not only in Spain, but in the world. And the different grapes that they use are like Garnacha Blanca, Malvasia, Chardonnay, Viura. There's actually a Tempranillo Blanco. There is some Sauvignon Blanc grown in there, and I think Maturana is another one that they use quite a bit. But a good deal of white wine grapes, and there's even some Rhone varietals in there like Marsanne and Roussanne. And some Rioja producers make some of the best white wine, not only in Spain, but in the world. The first wine we're going to have here from Lopez de Heredia also makes white wine, and a lot of collectors, or some collectors, seek out their whites more than their reds. And after you taste the reds, you'll find that absolutely incredible, but their whites are just simply amazing. So let's do a little history of Rioja first. Rioja has been a famous wine region at least since the Middle Ages, and it's often called the Bordeaux of Spain. And while that takes away a little bit from Rioja's unique wines and their unique styles, there's also a lot of truth in that. You know, starting in the Middle Ages, you had thousands upon thousands of Europeans who would make pilgrimages to St. James the Apostle's shrine, which is in, I think it's actually in Rice Baths. No, Galicia. I think it was in Galicia. And you would have pilgrims who would travel to Galicia, and if they came over the Pyrenees through France, the road that would go through Spain and eventually end up in Galicia was directly through Rioja. And so a lot of French winemakers who made the pilgrimage would kind of pass on their knowledge to Spanish winemakers, and even more influentially, would purchase land in Rioja that saw the potential of the winemaking there, and would buy and create their own wineries or bodegas in Spain. And then, fast forward a few centuries, 1850s, 1860s, phylloxera hits France, and phylloxera is caused by this particular avid or bug, and it essentially destroys vineyards, destroys vines, just kills them. And until they figured out how to graft resistant rootstock to vines, there wasn't anything they could do about it. And so in the 1850s, 1860s, French winemakers went bankrupt, vineyards were destroyed, the French wine economy just went straight into the toilet. And many of them knew about Spain and the potential for Spanish winemaking, and decided to move to the winemaking regions of Spain and kind of plant their flag there and bring their traditions of French winemaking to Spain. A lot of them ended up in Rioja. Indeed, a lot of the bodegas in Spain and in Rioja specifically to this day still have roots in France and in French ownership. And as a result, because the French wine industry was essentially annihilated by phylloxera, Spain had a huge, not renaissance, but a huge kind of boom. They had a wine boom, especially in Rioja. Rioja became the center of the wine world in Europe for about 50, 60 years or so. And their wines became incredibly popular, not only in Spain, but throughout the world, in large part because of availability, and also eventually because of the quality of wines that came out of there. But phylloxera eventually hit all parts of Europe, and by 1900, 1901, you began to see phylloxera in Spain, and by 1905, nearly all the vineyards of Spain, including Rioja, were wiped out by phylloxera as well. So, early 20th century, the Spanish wine industry is in shambles, and quite frankly, including Rioja, the Spanish wine industry did not recover until the 1970s, 1980s. So what caused this? Well, the 20th century was not the happiest place in the world in terms of Spanish winemaking or Spain in general. I mean, you had World War I, you had phylloxera, then you had World War I from 1914 to 1918. Then you had, essentially 10 years after World War I, a Great Depression. And then, although Spain technically stayed out of World War II, there was a very famous civil war, the Spanish Civil War, that occurred in the 1930s. That resulted in Franco and his fascist regime taking over the country. And Franco stayed in power up until through the 70s. So, we think of fascism in terms of governments, certainly with Germany, Hitler, and World War II. But that legacy in terms of government fascist control stayed alive, unfortunately, in Spain for a long time, up until the 1970s, up until Franco died. So after the Spanish Civil War and after World War II, there were multiple famines in Spain. And so Franco had ordered the vineyards, to be ripped up and to be replanted with wheat to help feed the starving people. And so the wine industry takes another hit, albeit to feed people, which is necessary and needed. But in terms of the number of setbacks that the Spanish wine industry had, the fascist regime, which helped to cause a lot of that starvation, certainly did not help. And then after that, you started to have a rebirth of Spanish winemaking in the 70s, and especially the early 80s, with these two regions. And one of the amazing things about Spain and the Spanish people is their creativity, their endurance, and their kind of willingness to just persevere. And I can't think of another country that did more to rebuild its reputation as a great winemaking country in such a short period of time as Spain did. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to Ribera del Duero, because that's kind of where it really shined. But Spain in general, I mean, if we're talking about from the early 80s till now, in the span of 40 years, completely revamped and completely re-solidified its place as a winemaking giant in terms of quantity to a certain extent, but quality as well. And so Rioja, a lot of French influence, went through a period of heavy boom and then a long period of downtrodden times, and that was all of Spain, not just Rioja, but then kind of a revival in the 70s and 80s that is continuing to this day, in large part because of the winery we're about to kind of talk about here in a minute. Now, Rioja as a wine region itself it can be pretty complex, but if you want to dive super deep into it, but on the surface, it's actually a fairly easy wine industry to understand if we kind of break it up into little chunks. You know, there are three main wine regions in Spain, Rioja: Rioja Alta, Rioja Baja, and Rioja Alavesa. Rioja Alto is the most popular one. It's where a lot of the great vineyards like Muga, Cune, Lopez de Heredia. There's a great winery called La Rioja Alto, which is in Rioja Alta. And so the most well-known wineries and what are considered the best wineries in Rioja come from, for the most part, Rioja Alta. Rioja Alavesa is a little bit to the east, more towards the Basque Country, also makes incredible wine. And Rioja Baja, which is a little further south and east, is mostly known, I guess, for the kind of rustic table wines. But even there are a lot of wineries that are doing amazing stuff. So I don't like to generalize about these things too much, but Rioja Alta is the main region, but Alavesa and Baja both have high quality wineries and a lot of really nice wine. But basically those are your three regions. The Ebro River is the main source of water that kind of runs through, or body of water that runs through the region of Rioja. And in terms of classification, Rioja does have a pretty specific and pretty strict classification of their wines. Their wines, like I said, are made mostly from red wines. At least are made mostly from Tempranillo, but they can also use Grenache, which is Grenache in the rest of the world. They can use some Mazuelo. They can use some Graciano. And that's about it. Those are probably the four red grapes at least you see most of, and the majority of them being Tempranillo. So your main classifications of red wines in Rioja are Crianza, Reserva, and Gran Reserva. And so they'll typically be on the labels of most, but not all, Spanish wines. The Lopez de Heredia Basconia that we're going to try here in a second is a Reserva, 2008. And we'll get into the 2008 part in a second. So basically those three classifications do definitely designate a specific aging regimen. So Crianza, if the label says Crianza on a Spanish wines, it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years, 1 year in barrel, 1 year in bottle. Remember, these are minimums. Reserva is 3 years, again, 1 year in barrel and 2 year in bottle. And there's Gran Reserva, which is 5 years. So a Gran Reserva must be at least 5 years old before it's released. Of those 5 years, at least 2 years must be in barrel, 3 years must be in bottle. Rioja gets a little complicated for two reasons. One is those are minimum requirements. So a winery like Lopez de Heredia. Another big difference between Rioja and Ribera del Duero. is there are a lot of producers who age their wines in Rioja an incredibly long time before releasing them to market. So the Basconia, 2008 from Lopez de Heredia. That's the recent vintage. Lopez de Heredia, for almost all of their wines, actually for all of their wines, including their whites, will release wines that have a minimum of 10 years of age. So the recent release, so this is, I think the 2008 was released in 2020. So this is a 12-year-old wine. They just released it last year. And there are other wineries that do that, not usually as extreme as Lopez de Heredia, but, 5 years for Gran Reserva, 3 years for Reserva, 2 years for Crianza. This is a Reserva that was aged for 12 years before it was released. So it gets a little dicey there. It also gets a little dicey in terms of complex, in terms of old world versus new, or old winemaking versus traditional winemaking, versus kind of new modern methods of winemaking. So you have people like Lopez de Heredia who age wines a long time in barrel and bottle, but also make wines in the traditional sense of elegance, finesse, complexity. Don't release it until it's ready. And then you have slightly more modern winemakers like Ramirez de Ganuza, who release Riojas not quite, still younger than Lopez de Heredia, but they're bigger, they're more modern, they're oaky, they're big, full-bodied, enriched. Muga does this too, although Muga kind of straddles that line. They have some stuff, like a lot of their standard reds and their reservas are definitely a little more New World and modern, but they have their Gran Reserva Prado Aneo, which is incredible. That's a little more traditional. So some wineries are in one corner traditional, in other corners no, big, oaky, new, modern, and then you have some wineries that kind of fall in the middle. So you have this kind of like, hey, we'll just release it when we think it's ready. That makes Rioja a little complicated sometimes, and then that traditional versus more modern New World style of winemaking, that kind of push and pull between the two, which takes place in all over Europe. That happens in Italy, that happens in France as well, even a little bit in Germany and Austria. So let's get into Lopez de Heredia now. I'm ready to drink after all this talking. All right. Ooh, much better. It smells amazing. I needed a break from all that talking, so I decided to kind of sniff and sip while I took a pause. So the first winery, first of two, is, I'm so happy to be able to share this. Some of you may have had this, or at least have had some of their wines before, but our first wine is going to be the 2008 Lopez de Heredia Vina Basconia. So Lopez de Heredia makes a number of different wines, but only 4 vineyards. They have 4 vineyards, and Basconia is one of the vineyards, along with Tandonia, Cubillo, and where they get some of their whites, as well as Zaconia, and they're all incredible vineyards. The grapes they get out of these vineyards and the quality of all their wines are phenomenal. They're average about 45 years old in terms of how old the vines are. Some are quite a bit older, some are a little younger, but the mean age of the vines is 45 years old. There are very few wineries in all of Spain that are spoken with such awe and reverence, and to be frank, they're fawned over. These wines are gobbled up by collectors. I would call it a cult wine, but these wines have gotten so popular over the last 10 or 15 years that I don't know if you can even call them cult wines anymore. But people go crazy for these wines, and rightfully so. This was one of the first wineries I discovered when I first started in the wine business 20 years ago. Lopez de Heredia is one of the reasons why I fell in love with Spain and Spanish wineries and to begin with. It was one of the first wines I would kind of collect and put down, and it was always a very, very special thing for me to be able to buy these wines when we're able to get them. They are limited release. The Basconia and Tondonia Reservas, we can get maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a year. Grand Reservas maybe once. The whites, even less. The whites we get maybe once a year. The whites are kind of more revered than the reds, which, as I said earlier, when you try these reds, you'll be amazed, but it's true. The whites are really unique. If you ever see a Lopez de Heredia white, I encourage you to pick them up. The reds and whites are not inexpensive at all, but they're not outrageously priced either. So as a special treat, the whites almost have this nutty oxidation, but in the best possible way. You probably will not have tried any white wine like it in your life. So incredible stuff. But the reds, we're focusing on the reds, and in this case, 2008 Vino Basconia. So like I said, they don't release these wines until they think they're ready to drink, and that's always, I can't think of a time they didn't, but 10 to 10 plus years of aging. The Basconia, the 2008, spent 5 years in barrel, but because the wine is already almost 13 years old, when you smell it, you don't get this like heavy like you would in Napa or Ribera del Duero with cabs or Ribera del Duero Tempranillo. You don't get that oaky, creamy nose at all. There's no dill, there's herbaceousness, but had nothing to do with the oak. This is mostly, and it's over 70% Tempranillo. They do use some Graciano, they use some Mazuelo, and they do use some Grenache in this as well, but like I said, it's over 70% of Tempranillo. Actually, it might be closer to 80%. And if you kind of tip the glass a little bit, it's 13 years old. It still has amazing color to it. As red wines get older, the depth of the red color will change to like a brick red to a brownish, like tawny color. And the red on the edges of this is still pretty bright. It is starting to turn a little bit brick in color, but it's still got a lot of color, a lot of life. And the nose is great. Compared to the Tondonia, which is the other red that you see the most of here in the States. No, it's like the Cubilla you see too. But compared to the Tondonia, the Basconia is typically a little fuller, a little richer, and is a little more bright, where the Tondonia will be kind of have all the smokiness and cigar box and tobacco, and that'll get super tawny in color. The Basconia always has this brightness. I think they do use a little bit more Grenache and Mazuelo in the Basconia, which might account for some of that, but it also has to do with the vineyard site and where they're getting the vine, and where they're getting the grapes. Man, that fruit is still so vibrant, which is amazing on a wine that's that old. And a little spice. A little earthy, but more like fresh, like almost like forest floor, like fresh and green. Excuse my swishing, but to get the full appreciation of a wine, you should definitely swish in your mouth there. Sorry, I'm gonna pull that down. This is incredible. And the finish is amazing. And this is why I chose this wine, is because I really wanted to emphasize the difference between Rioja and Ribera del Duero. And Lopez de Heredia wines are just classic Rioja. It's still got the fruit, it's still got, decent body to it, but it's also got this elegance to it, this beautiful, beautiful balance. This is just incredible. It's got all the right notes and the seamless balance, and the finish is still going on in my mouth, and man, this is great. And on the information packet I sent you, I sent this quote or this, actually it was just an article, this guy Neil Martin used to be I think he still is, I don't know, a wine critic. He used to write for Robert Parker's Wine Advocate years ago, and he talks about visiting Lopez de Heredia back in like 2011, 2010, maybe even back further. And I kind of wrote a copy of that excerpt of Neil's description of it. And when I talked earlier about people fawning over Lopez de Heredia, I mean, he's like, you know, it's like it's a fanaticism for some people. And he speaks about it so beautifully, and you would think he was like, I've never been lucky enough to go to Lopez de Heredia. I've been to Rioja, haven't been able to go here yet. But with Neil and with other people who have written about it and people I know who have visited, it's like they're stepping back into another time. The winery has changed so little in its 130 or 140 years of existence. It's like taking a time machine back. And very little has changed. Obviously, some things have been updated. It's not like they're using, you know, they do have some modern winemaking techniques they're using, but they're still doing a lot of the stuff they did 130, 140 years ago. And like I said, when you read Neil's, just kind of laying out the beauty of the wine and of the winery and his feelings of it, it'll kind of give you a sense how other people feel about it. It's incredible. This wine is awesome. If you wanted to hold this for another 5-10 years, you can. It doesn't have a ton of structure left in terms of tannin, so it's something you can drink really easily now. But I've had these wines so often over the years that there's so much flavor and texture and complexity in this wine that you could put it down another 5, 8, 10 years if you want to, and it'd still be delicious. But why wait? Why wait? This is absolutely killer. I hope you enjoy as much as I do. Cheers. Now let's talk about a second wine region, which is Ribera del Duero. So we talked about Ribera del Duero almost being the, you know, you talk about 180 from what we talked about with Rioja. We're talking about now kind of the high plains of Spain. We're about 2 hours north of Madrid, and just rough and tumble, like mesas, plateaus, just a very rugged, arid land. It's, you know, think about, have you ever seen any of the old spaghetti westerns with Clint Eastwood? Some of them were actually filmed, or some parts of them were actually filmed in Spain, not just Italy. But, you know, there's, if not for the Duero River, which runs directly through Ribera del Duero, what the region is named after, and almost splits it in half, without the influence of the river, the region would almost be nothing but an arid desert wasteland. It gets hot, really hot during the day, during the summer, really cold at night, which is super helpful when it comes to growing wines. We've talked about this with other wine regions. You want warm days to hot days, and then you want really cool nights to cool those grapes down. Ribera del Duero kind of fits into that, a little more extreme on the heat side than a lot of great red wine making regions. But they get those super cool nights, which kind of makes it work perfectly. And even the vines themselves, even the Tinto Fino vines, just are a reflection of the super tough, rough landscape of Ribera del Duero. The vines are just kind of gnarled and old, and they look like they're suffering, which is what you want for vines. I mean, it looks like the earth is like grasping onto the vines and barely holding on. And you know, they don't do a lot of classical training in Ribera either in terms of how they lay out the vines. So it's, you know, it looks like they're old and suffering and they're a mess. But because of this rough topography and climate, the vines do exactly what you want them to do. They look like they struggle because they are struggling, and that's what you want. If you were gonna start like a Smucker's Jam production facility, I wouldn't plant grapes in Ribera del Duero. If you were wanting to make incredible red wine, I would absolutely plant vines in Ribera del Duero. For wines, you want them to struggle. When vines struggle, they dig deep into the earth. They produce less clusters on the vine. However, the energy that the vine can now expend all goes into just those few clusters. So perfect grape growing, red wine at least for Ribera del Duero. The other really interesting thing is, in terms of comparing it to Rioja, is even though we're talking about the same grape, Tempranillo in Rioja, Tinta de Pais and Tinta Fino in Ribera del Duero, the grapes look different. The grapes actually have adapted to the rough climate in Ribera del Duero. Compared to Rioja, the Tempranillo grapes there are much smaller. They have a lot thicker skin. Again, that's because of the heat and extreme dryness of Ribera del Duero. And because of that, they produce, in general, much bigger wines, more tannic wine. Think about the thicker the grapes of the skin, I said that backwards, the thicker the skin on the grapes, you tend to have bigger, more tannic wines, because wine is only red because the juice sits on the grape skins. You know, we mentioned this plenty of times before. If you press red wine grape and just let the juice run free, it's white. Sometimes it could be a little pink, but it's white. You can make white wine out of red grapes, red wine grapes. What gives red wine from red wine grapes its color is the juice sitting on the skins, and how red they get and how tannic they get often is directly related to how long the juice and the grapes intermingle, how long the grapes' skins sit in the juice. So if you have thicker skins, you have higher tannin content in those grape skins. And so you tend to produce more tannic, more structured wines. And so a lot of the difference stylistically between Ribera del Duero and Rioja are directly related to the topography, the types, how the grapes function in those two regions. And of course, winemaking plays a part of it. You can manipulate things. You could do things as a winemaker to make wines more tannic or give them more color or structure, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, these are very natural differences. Ribera del Duero has had probably even a rougher wine history than Rioja. Of course, they went through phylloxera as well. Ribera del Duero was equally influenced by the tearing out of vineyards during the Franco regime, as any other region in Spain. And then even as Rioja started to kind of reestablish itself as a great winemaking region, Ribera still struggled. And Ribera del Duero, up until the 80s, was never seen, even before phylloxera, as a great winemaking region. The wines there, pre-phylloxera and post-phylloxera, were always seen as kind of rough and tumble, a lot like the topography, really astringent. It was really a region of mediocrity. And that's maybe being a little more generous. But then two wineries really changed all of that, and not only put Ribera del Duero on the map, but transformed Spain into a world wine heavyweight, even more so than Rioja. And those two wineries are Vega Sicilia and Tinto Pesquera. They invested money, technology, modern winemaking techniques, and began to create in the early 80s, 81 if you want to get specific with Vega Sicilia and Tinto Pesquera for that matter, into just otherworldly wines. And they still make unbelievable wines. Of course, Vega Sicilia is in the argument for the most popular and sought after wine in all of Spain, throughout the world. Vega Sicilia bottles go for over $1,000, or the Unico, I should say, goes for over $1,000 just for a single bottle. They also make a wine called Valbuena, which is more in the $200 range. So not very inexpensive either, but certainly a lot more affordable than $1,000. But you know, it's as sought after as any Premier Cru or, you know, first class Bordeaux, first growth Bordeaux, or Grand Cru Burgundy. It is one of those cult wines that collectors salivate over. Tinto Pesquera is a more affordable, even to this day, Ribera del Duero. Their Crianza, their Reserva will run, you know, I haven't had Tinto Pesquera in years, but when I was still drinking Tinto Pesquera, you could get it still, the Crianza, I think, for $40, $50. You might have to check Google to see if that's still around the same price point. And even the Reserva was fairly affordable. They make wine every couple of years called Jeunesse, which is only the best vintages, and still every time I have it, it's some of the best wine out there, period. But even that's a little more affordable than the Vega Sicilia Unico. But those are the two wineries that kind of propelled Ribera del Duero. And even when it gained DOC status, Ribera del Duero, or in Spain, I guess, there were only a handful of wineries. But these two wineries inspired other wineries that existed still, like Emilio Moro, which we're going to have in a minute. I think Abadi Retuerta was still around then as well. But to kind of up their game, everyone saw what they were doing, saw the possibility of how great wines could be in Ribera del Duero from Pesquera, from Sicilia, and copied them, stepped up the game, and with great success. And then in the mid-90s, Ribera del Duero kind of had another kind of burst of creativity, burst of fantastic winemaking, it seemingly all at once, specifically with like Pingus. Pingus is another cult wine from Ribera del Duero that runs, again, I think $1,000 a bottle. But they make a Flor de Pingus, which is around $110, $115 a bottle. And then wineries like Moro sent Ribera del Duero into this entirely different stratosphere. And there was this kind of second qualitative revolution in Ribera del Duero that inspired even more wineries there. And now it's considered one of the great winemaking regions in the world. And the reason I have loved Ribera del Duero so much, or one of the reasons, is it's hard for me to think of another wine region that did so much in such a short period of time to create these wines and to create this reputation of quality over a 30 year period. And now it's 40 and 50 years and it keeps expanding. But it's really remarkable. You know, it was considered, you know, Chianti had the problem, Italy had a problem, like Tuscany, but they always had a tradition of good winemaking there. Like Ribera del Duero was almost considered trash up until the early 80s. And what they've done since then is really phenomenal. And again, speaks to the creativity and just the persistent spirit of the Spanish people, and really remarkable. So without further ado, let's get into our second fantastic wine, Emilio Moro. All right, so now getting into our second wine. And right away you smell the difference. This is, I mean, it almost smells like purple. What does purple smell like? You'll know when you smell this wine. It's rich. I could smell the oak. You could almost smell how heavy it's going to be. A lot of red and dark fruits. So their second wine is a outstanding and now famous producer in Ribera del Duero, or better known, Emilio Moro. Emilio Moro makes a number of different wines, 4 or 5 different wines in the Ribera del Duero region. This was kind of their flagship. 2018 vintage. You see, even though they're Ribera del Duero, they do say Tempranillo, so they're not using the local names for the Tempranillo grape. You'll notice too, let me make sure I'm doing this correctly, but yeah, Ribera del Duero does have technically the same designations as Rioja when it comes to aging their wines, Crianza, Reserva, Gran Reserva, and they mean the same thing. That it's 2 years for Crianza, 3 years for Reserva, 5 years for Gran Reserva. But there are a lot of producers in Ribera del Duero who do not do that at all. Like Tinto Pesquero does do Reserva, Crianza Reserva, Gran Reserva, but other people like Emilio Moro, Pingus, they don't do that. They kind of stand on their own. It's a way of, I guess, separating themselves. Emilio Moro as a winery has been around since the late 19th century, and so was one of those wineries that was doing good things before a lot of other people were, but was still kind of middling, and so they didn't become as well known until other wineries kind of launched Ribera del Duero into people's awareness and consciousness as this great winemaking region. But Emilio Moro has certainly more than made up for any time lost in terms of quality. Ooh. Wow. So these two wines work perfectly as side-by-side comparisons as Tempranillo from Rioja and Tempranillo from Ribera del Duero. I mean, it just can't be. The Emilio Moro is heavy. It's dense. As soon as you drink it, I just think it's dense. Big purple fruit. It's like red and black fruit put together is what I mean by purple, I guess. But man, is that thing dense. It's almost like eating a dry, spiced, savory Christmas cake. Oh, if spiced Christmas cake was awesome. Oh, and tannin. I can't speak. I'm trying to speak and my mouth is drying out on me, which makes it very difficult. I have a difficult time enough not mumbling my words, let alone with the big tannic wine in my mouth. But just incredible stuff. I love Emilio Moro. They do like a little Finca de Rosaldo wine that's like 16, 17 bucks a bottle. That is really superb. But this is kind of their standard bearer. They do one that's slightly higher end, or two that are slightly higher end than the standard Emilio Moro. But man, I think you're really gonna love both of these wines. But people who if you're a big cab drinker, if you like big, heavy, dense wines, and you're looking to where do I start in Spain, Ribera del Duero is where you want to go. It's been harder and harder to find really well priced Ribera del Duero. Spain used to be a great place. Rioja especially used to be a great space for value-driven wines. And Spain in general is still, you go to Yecla or Rumilla, or, if you like great whites, Galicia at good prices. So there is great value to be found. And even in Rioja, you can find some great value, especially with Crianza stuff. But in a lot of Rioja and a lot of Ribera del Duero, so many people have caught on in terms of the quality of these wines, and so many high ratings and so many collectors buying, and that eventually the prices have kind of gone up quite a bit. So there's still value to be found in Rioja, especially a little bit in Ribera del Duero if you know where to look. But Spain in general, yes, you just have to kind of be willing to kind of span out and be adventurous. So Emilio Moro, there's not much else to say about them, just how fantastic the wines are. They are very active in their community. Emilio Moro and the Moro family, who still runs Emilio Moro, does a lot of charitable work. They're very much into their community. They've done a lot of charitable work for the blind, and have been for a long time now. In fact, the Emilio Moro, their labels always have a braille which this is the name of the wine across the winery. And so they just have a real connectivity to the place they're from, which is another reason why I love them so much, besides, the great tasting wine. So I'm gonna sit here, turn off the video, and enjoy this wine in private. I hope you enjoyed this wine as much as I do. I will say, usually the wine cache, we did do 3 or 4 wines for our wine clubs. In this case, we did just do 2, but there's a very good reason we did 2. These are, unless by some miracle I find some other wines out there that I wasn't expecting to find, these are probably the 2 best wines you're gonna get all year from the Wine Cache Club. And I always try to pick fantastic wines. I love to hear feedback. People have enjoyed wines for the most part. If you don't enjoy a wine, I'm happy to hear that as well, because that gives me a little bit better direction. But I always pick wines that I love and I think other people will love. But I have not picked wines for this club yet that I love more, and it will be super challenging for me to find 2 that will be of this high of quality and pedigree in the future. But that'll be a great challenge for me. But instead of a 3rd wine in your little box that you pick up next week, you will find a little surprise. You will have a 3rd bottle, but it won't be wine. It'll be a little Spanish cider, hard cider, the good stuff. In my opinion, the Spanish make the best cider in the world. I know the French Normans will wring my neck if they ever hear me say that or catch me saying that. And Normandy does make fantastic cider. They're incredible cider producers in the US as well. But the Spanish ciders, especially in and around the Basque, there's a certain funkiness that they have that's just amazing. So enjoy that little treat, but the stars of these are definitely the wine. So please leave your comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about these wines. They're both ready to drink now. The Emilio Moro you could actually save and lay down for 10 years if you want to. It's a great starter wine for a cellar, or it's a great addition to any cellar collection. It does have enough tannin and structure that'll go 10 plus years pretty easy. And some of that fruit and tannin will kind of dissipate a little bit, and you will start to get secondary flavors, and it will kind of balance it. But this is just incredible right now. So I'm gonna enjoy a little privacy with my wine. Enjoy, and we'll see you soon.